The world didn't end with an explosion. It ended with a knock. 3 taps on my front door. Sharp, disciplined, and familiar enough to make my spine lock. You never forget that sound when you've served. It's the rhythm that delivers news no soldier's wife or widow ever wants to hear. I stood frozen in the hallway, my palms still wet from washing the breakfast dishes. The sunlight through the blinds cut across the floor in perfect little stripes, as if even God didn't want to see what came next. When I opened the door, 2 officers stood there. Their uniforms were pressed, their faces grave. Behind them, a black SUV idled, engine humming like a mechanical prayer. "Captain Rose Puller?" the taller one said. I nodded. My throat was sand. "Ma'am, we regret to inform you." The rest blurred into static. Regret, explosion, off-grid, mission unlisted. The words hung in the air like shrapnel, slow and invisible, slicing through me as they fell. I remember gripping the door frame so hard my knuckles went white. I didn't cry, not then. Military wives don't cry in front of officers, especially not former soldiers. We learn early that grief is a private war. When they left, they took his name off the roster. But they didn't take his ghost out of my house. That night, I sat in his chair, the one by the window where he used to polish his boots before every mission. His scent was still there, gun oil and cedar. I stared at his photo on the wall. Major George Puller, Special Recon Unit, a man who could make silence feel safe. But now the silence felt like an enemy. They said it was an accident. But George never did accidents. Something in the report didn't fit. And something in me refused to rest. 2 weeks passed. The military sent a folded flag, a condolence letter, and a medal I couldn't look at without shaking. I buried him without a body. Just a name on a stone and a hollow salute. But closure. That's a word civilians use. Soldiers don't get closure. We get orders. And the last order he ever gave me was one I hadn't realized until that day. Never stop asking why. One evening, I went into the garage, a space he'd claimed as his quiet bunker. I hadn't touched it since he left for that final deployment. The air smelled of dust, diesel, and unfinished business. In the corner, under a tarp, was his old footlocker, locked, heavy, with a faint layer of desert sand still crusted on the hinges. The military had already cleared his belongings, but this one box, they'd missed. Or maybe he'd meant for them to. I sat down on the cold floor and stared at it for a long time. There was a single marking on the side, in faint black stencil paint. Unit 47, Echo Division. But George wasn't Echo Division. He was attached to Alpha Recon, or so the official files said. That was the first crack in their story. The lock was old, but familiar. I had the tools. An ex-soldier's habits die hard. I picked it open, slow and steady, my hands trembling not from fear but from recognition. Inside, a stack of sealed envelopes, one small drive wrapped in cloth, and a single note written in his handwriting. It read, "If you're reading this, it means the mission failed. Don't trust the file under my name. The truth isn't in the report, it's in what they erased." My heart stopped. I touched the drive like it might burn me. And for the first time since that knock on the door, I whispered his name. Not like a memory, but like a code waiting to be decrypted. George. What did you do? That night, sleep became impossible. Every sound outside felt like surveillance. Every shadow like someone listening. My soldier's instincts came back like ghosts from training. Check the windows, secure the perimeter, silence the phone. But this wasn't the battlefield anymore. This was home. And somehow, home had become the most dangerous place of all. When dawn broke, I packed a small bag, the same way I used to before covert runs. Old habits, old armor. If the truth was buried in that drive, I was going to dig it up, even if it meant following my husband into the dark. We met in the desert, not in a cafe or under some poetic sunset. It was the kind of place where sand replaces sleep and silence replaces small talk. I was a fresh intel officer, recently assigned to the Forward Operations Base in Al-Hadar Province, a nameless stretch of Middle Eastern heat and dust where maps lied and radio signals died halfway through a sentence. George was already a legend by then. The kind of soldier whose name carried weight in every tent. Quiet, precise, unnervingly calm. They said he could read an ambush before it happened. They also said he never lost a man under his watch. I believed both. Our first conversation wasn't romantic. It was tactical. He walked into the ops room one night while I was poring over intercepted transmissions from a local insurgent network. Without introduction, he leaned over the map and pointed to a ridgeline. "Those signals aren't random," he said. "They're triangulating movement. Someone's watching us." I looked up at him. Tall, composed, eyes like gunmetal. "And who are you?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "The one who doesn't like surprises." That was George. No rank, no preamble, just purpose. Over the months that followed, we became an unlikely team. He handled the ground, I handled the intel. He'd come back from missions coated in dust, and I'd decode what he brought back. Whispers, coordinates, fragments of something bigger. Somewhere between war briefings and black coffee at 0300 hours. The soldier in me started to see the man behind the uniform. He'd always take off his helmet the moment he entered base. Said he hated barriers. I once asked him if he ever got tired of fighting ghosts we couldn't see. He said, "We don't fight ghosts, Rose. We fight the people who pretend they don't exist." That line stayed with me. Even now, when we finally married, it wasn't under fairy lights. It was under a tarp tent with 2 witnesses, a field chaplain, and the smell of gun oil in the air. He promised me safety, and I promised him truth. We both lied, not out of choice, but out of duty, because in our line of work, truth is a classified threat. A year later, they reassigned me to Joint Command, Intelligence Oversight. That's when I first saw the cracks. Files would go missing, coordinates would shift overnight, and entire missions would vanish from the system. When I asked why, I got the same answer every time. Need-to-know basis. But I did need to know. Because George's unit was often the one sent in after those missing files. One night, while running routine data sweeps, I came across a restricted channel labeled E47, not part of our authorized database. I traced it to a series of encrypted transmissions routed through a satellite I wasn't supposed to access. The messages were short, clinical. They mentioned extractions, asset relocation, and one term I'd never seen before, Operation Sand Veil. George's name appeared in the metadata. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. We sat in silence on the rooftop of the base housing that night, the horizon glowing orange from distant fires. He finally said, "Sometimes orders aren't written down, Rose. Sometimes they're buried because the people giving them know they shouldn't exist." I remember the way his jaw tightened when he said that. Like every word cost him a piece of peace he couldn't afford to lose. A month later, I was pulled from active intel work. Reassignment due to conflict of interest, they said. In plain language, it meant, you're getting too close to something we want quiet. George didn't argue. He just held my hand and said, "Stay out of it." "Promise me." I promised, and broke it the moment he left for his next mission, because that's what love does to soldiers. It turns loyalty into rebellion. I kept watching from afar, through the data feeds, the communications logs, the few remaining channels I still had clearance for. That's when I saw it again. Echo Division. Unit 47. Same code from the footlocker I would one day open, but back then, I didn't know what it meant. I only knew that it followed him like a shadow through every deployment report. And then, one day it stopped appearing entirely. The files ended abruptly, like someone had wiped them clean. George came home briefly before his final mission. His eyes were different, sharper, quieter. He didn't talk about where he'd been, that night, over cold tea and the hum of the ceiling fan. He said something I didn't understand until much later. If something ever happens to me, don't let them tell you it was for nothing. I thought it was just another soldier's superstition. but now I know. It was a warning disguised as love. 2 weeks later, he left. And a month after that came the knock. But sitting here now, holding his message in my hands, I see it all differently. The encrypted channels, the erased reports, the ghost missions. They weren't mistakes. They were breadcrumbs. George was leaving me a trail long before he was gone, and if the file he mentioned was part of Operation Sand Veil, then his death wasn't a casualty. I used to believe ghosts only existed on battlefields, the ones that linger after explosions in the echoes of names shouted through smoke. But that night, when I plugged George's drive into my old field laptop, the one still scarred from a sandstorm in Al-Hadar, I realized ghosts don't live in ruins. They live in data, in the things we're not supposed to see. The screen blinked once, then filled with static before stabilizing. A single folder appeared, Sand Veil Confidential. Below it, a prompt, Enter Authentication Code. I typed his service ID. Nothing. I tried our anniversary. Still nothing. Then I remembered something George used to say during training missions. When we were decoding intercepted chatter for fun, a password is only strong if it means nothing to anyone but you. So I typed Echo 47, and the drive unlocked. Inside were dozens of encrypted files, each named after coordinates, grid points scattered across the Middle East. Every file carried the same timestamp, 2 days before his death. I clicked the first. A blurred video feed loaded, black and white, grainy, recorded from a drone. It showed a convoy of unmarked trucks moving through a desert valley under moonlight. Then a sudden explosion. The feed cut to black audio kicked in, George's voice. Echo team compromised. Extraction aborted. Asset not secured. Mission parameters. Altered by command. If this log survives, someone needs to know what they're hiding in the sand. My breath caught. Hiding in the sand. He wasn't speaking in metaphors. I clicked another file. It showed a list of local operatives under false civilian identities, cross-referenced with military intel designations. But some of the codenames weren't insurgents. They were ours, embedded deep within our own task forces. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. Operation Sand Veil wasn't a mission to stop enemies. It was a cleanup. They were erasing entire field units that had seen something they weren't supposed to. And George had found out. Around midnight, I heard a car engine outside my house. Parked too long. Lights off. Instinct screamed again. The kind of alert that doesn't fade even years after discharge. I shut the laptop, killed the lights, and reached for my Glock from the drawer. Not paranoia, the procedure. Peering through the blinds, I saw silhouettes in the car. 2 men, waiting, not neighbors. Not randoms, observers. They were here for the drive. I packed fast, laptop, charger, field notes, and the only photo of George I still kept out. I slipped out the back alley, engine running before they even noticed. Driving through the empty streets, the city felt like a battlefield made of neon and silence. Every red light felt like a target. Every rear-view glance, a question. I didn't stop until I reached the outskirts, an old motel near the highway that led toward the desert. A place no one used unless they had something to hide. Room 12 smelled of rust and cheap air freshener. But it was quiet. I set up the laptop again. There were still files I hadn't opened, ones marked with encryption so heavy it felt intentional. Layers over layers. George had always said, if something's that well protected, it's either gold or poison. I ran the decryption protocol, the same one we used back in field intelligence. It took 40 minutes. The progress bar crawled, like time itself was testing my patience. When it hit 100%, a final document appeared, mission summary, Sand Veil, objective terminated authorized by C. Hawthorne, Echo Command. My pulse froze. Colonel Charles Hawthorne, George's commanding officer, the same man who gave me the folded flag at my doorstep. I scrolled further. There was a list of personnel marked KIA, reclassified. George's name was there, but next to it, in red text, were the words, Status Unconfirmed, Unconfirmed. That meant no body. No proof, no closure. They hadn't lost him. They'd hidden him. I sat there for a long time, the screen's glow washing over me like interrogation light. If George was alive, he was off-grid, trapped, detained, or worse. If he wasn't, then someone had faked his death to bury what he'd found. Either way, this file wasn't just evidence. It was a confession, and the people watching my house, they weren't there to threaten me. They were there to contain me. The motel clock read 3:45 a.m. when the power suddenly cut out. The screen went black. Footsteps in the hallway. I grabbed my weapon, crouched by the bed. Door handle turned, slow, deliberate. Then a voice. "Captain Rahman, we need the drive." It wasn't a request. I didn't answer. Just aimed for the silhouette's shadow. When they pushed through, I fired once into the wall beside the frame. A warning shot. The kind that says I'm not the widow you expected. They backed off. Retreated down the hall. Seconds later, tires screeched outside. I waited until silence returned, then grabbed my things and ran for the back exit. Outside, the night was cold, vast, and merciless. I stood under a flickering motel sign, my heart still pounding. The drive clutched to my chest like a lifeline. Somewhere deep inside those encrypted files was the reason my husband died. And now, for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted him to be alive, or if that truth would destroy what was left of me. As dawn cracked over the desert, I whispered to the horizon, "If you're out there, George, I'm coming for you." And the wind answered, dry, fierce and hollow, like a soldier's salute. By morning, I was somewhere between nowhere and regret, a long stretch of desert highway behind me and a storm waiting ahead. The horizon shimmered like heat hallucination, but I was wide awake. Soldiers learn to live on adrenaline and ghosts. I had both. The drive was my only weapon now. Inside it, a war George had started to uncover, one that didn't exist on any official record. And Colonel Hawthorne's name was written all over it. I pulled over at a gas station that looked like it hadn't seen a customer since the last war. Bought a burner laptop and a prepaid satellite link. Old habits die hard. If they were tracking my personal systems, I needed to disappear, just like George had. Inside the cracked plastic casing of that new laptop, I loaded the drive again. The folder tree glowed back to life. Same code names, same encrypted feeds. But this time I looked deeper. The metadata, the subdirectories, the footprints left by the ones who tried to hide. One string of coordinates caught my eye. 31.4207 again, 38.2565 Dagi. Right on the border of Al-Hadar, our old base of operations. George had marked it 3 times in red. The title of that folder, Final Directive. I opened it. The document wasn't just intel. It was an execution log. It listed 3 field agents, their code names, mission numbers, and final status. Neutralized, declassified. But the 4th name stopped me cold. Echo 6, Major GP, and beneath it, a file attachment labeled Directive H. When I clicked it open, a still image appeared. Hawthorne standing in front of a whiteboard with maps behind him. The video feed had no audio, but the timestamp matched the night George went dark. Behind Hawthorne, scribbled in red marker, were the words, Phase 2 begins once Echo 6 is contained. Contained. Not killed. It hit me like recoil. George hadn't died on that mission. He'd been silenced. I sat there staring at that single word until my reflection blurred in the screen. It wasn't grief anymore that burned through me. It was purpose. The kind of fire only betrayal can light. For years, I'd worn the same uniform as those men, saluted the same flag, followed the same code. But now, I realized the code was only meant to protect those who broke it. If the military had buried him, I was going to dig him out. The next step was clear. Find Hawthorne. He'd been reassigned after George's death, transferred to a private defense contractor operating out of Dubai under a front called Ardent Solutions. I found it buried in procurement records. No public contact, no listed staff, just encrypted invoices and black budgets. but I knew how to find ghosts. I'd been married to one. 3 days later, I was on a flight under a false ID, carrying the drive disguised inside an old field radio casing. Dubai's skyline rose like glass in defiance, a city built to forget where it came from. I rented a car, traced the coordinates tied to Ardent's logistics hub, and parked across the street from a warehouse compound lit with security drones and steel fences. Through the scope of my field monocular, I saw him, Colonel Hawthorne, older, thicker around the middle. But the same deliberate walk, the same arrogance and posture, the man who'd handed me my husband's flag, and suddenly I realized something cruel. He didn't look haunted. He looked comfortable. I needed proof. Something undeniable. Something even they couldn't erase. So I waited. 2 hours, 3. Then I saw it. A shipment being loaded into an unmarked truck. On the manifest taped to the crate in faint black letters, it read, E-47 Personnel Transfer, Echo 47. George's last unit. My heart felt like a gun about to misfire. That night, I broke into the compound. Security had changed since my active duty days. More drones. Fewer men, but human error never goes out of style. A camera loop, a badge clone, and an old uniform were all I needed. Once inside, I moved like muscle memory. Every corridor, every shadow, every silent breath was training resurfacing after years of sleep. In the central archive room, a terminal glowed with the same interface I'd seen in the files, Hawthorne's system. I connected the drive, bypassed the network firewalls, and started pulling data. The more I saw, the colder I felt. They weren't just eliminating units. They were testing new tech on them, bio-tracking, neural sync protocols, psychological conditioning experiments under the guise of field enhancements. George had uncovered evidence of their trials. Soldiers turned into test subjects. And when he tried to report it, they marked him Echo 6, compromised. That was the mission file he'd died for. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. The screen flashed. Unauthorized access detected. Hawthorne's voice echoed from the hallway. I told them she'd come eventually. He stepped in. Calm as ever, hands clasped behind his back like a man walking into a classroom, not a crime scene. Rose Puller, he said almost warmly. Still breaking into places you don't belong. Still killing men who trusted you? I shot back. He smiled. Your husband was a liability. He knew too much. You, on the other hand, he paused. You could still be useful. I raised my weapon, but he didn't flinch. You think this is about one man? Sandvale is bigger than any of us. I know, I said. That's why I'm ending it. The moment he stepped closer, I triggered the EMP charge I'd planted under the desk. The lights died. The server went dark. Hawthorne lunged, but I was faster. One strike to the jaw, another to the ribs. He fell, stunned. I grabbed the external backup from the mainframe and ran. Outside, alarms wailed. The sky over the compound was electric, streaked with red warning lights. I jumped the fence, hit the ground rolling, and didn't stop until the car doors shut behind me. As I drove away, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and smoke. I looked at the new drive in my hand, heavier than guilt, brighter than truth. George's final file wasn't just proof of corruption. It was a map to where they'd taken the survivors of Echo 47, and for the first time, the path forward was clear. I didn't sleep for 72 hours after Dubai. The new drive pulsed in my hands like a living thing, as if it knew the weight it carried. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw George standing in the dust again, whispering, "Don't let them tell you it was for nothing." Now I understood what nothing meant. It meant silence. It meant files erased, soldiers rewritten as statistics. But he'd left me one last breadcrumb, and I was following it into the fire. Back in an abandoned safe house outside Istanbul, I connected the new drive to a satellite link. The screen came alive with strings of code, encrypted folders, and one title that burned like a confession, E-47 Continuity Protocol. Inside were mission reports, test results, and fragments of footage recorded from helmet cams. Ghosted faces, blurred names, timestamps overlapping reality itself. But buried deep within the archive, I found something I wasn't ready to see. A video file labeled Subject 6R Observation. I clicked play, the screen flickered. A dimly lit medical tent. Rows of men, or what was left of them, strapped to operating tables. Machines hummed softly beside them, feeding into their veins. Their uniforms were stripped of insignia. No names. Just numbers. A figure walked past the camera. Hawthorne again, clipboard in hand. Subject 6R displays cognitive resilience post-procedure, he said, voice cold and precise. Recommend continued containment until memory conditioning stabilizes. Then the camera turned slightly, and I froze. The man on the table lifted his head, just enough for the light to hit his face, scarred, bruised, half-conscious, but unmistakable. George. My breath caught somewhere between disbelief and prayer. He was alive, but not free. I replayed the footage over and over, searching for something, anything. A landmark, a reflection, a clue to where the recording had been made. Then, behind him, I saw it. A marking on one of the oxygen tanks. Al Nair Facility, Sector 3, Al Nair. A remote base used for classified joint operations years ago, deep in the desert. I'd been there once before it was shut down. Or so they said. If George was inside, the official story of his death wasn't just a lie. It was a prison. For a long time I sat there shaking. Every part of me wanted to believe I could just go in and pull him out. But logic fought emotion. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was an execution ground. Still, soldiers don't ask if they'll make it back. We just plan how far we're willing to go before we fall. So I packed. Weapon, gear, and George's dog tags, cold against my skin, steady against my heart. 2 days later, I crossed into the desert disguised as a relief worker. The heat was merciless, every gust of wind carrying whispers of old battles and unmarked graves. When I reached the coordinates, Al Nair didn't look abandoned. It looked buried, half swallowed by sand, camouflaged under the illusion of ruin. But I could see the faint glow of power lines beneath the dunes, alive, operational, hidden. I waited until nightfall, crawled through the dust, and slipped inside through a maintenance tunnel. The air inside was sterile, too clean, too controlled. It smelled like secrets. I moved through the corridors like I had years ago in Al-Hadar, checking corners, counting cameras, listening for human noise. And then I heard it. A faint hum, mechanical, rhythmic. It led me to a chamber marked Containment Bay 3. Through the glass window, I saw rows of pods. Inside each, a soldier suspended in a gel-like fluid, electrodes trailing from their temples. Their vitals blinked faintly on monitors beside them. They weren't dead. They weren't alive. They were kept, and in the center pod. George, my knees nearly gave out. I pressed a hand to the glass. His eyes were closed, his body still, his skin pale beneath the dim light. I whispered, "George, it's me." No answer. Just the low hum of the machines. I found the control panel, scanned through the logs. Each pod listed an experiment phase: neural stability, cognitive reprogramming, operational reset. They weren't healing them. They were rewriting them. Hawthorne's voice echoed in my mind. Sandvale is bigger than any of us. Now I knew what he meant. They weren't just erasing files. They were erasing people. I started the shutdown sequence. The console demanded authorization. I used George ID again. Denied. I bypassed it, triggered the manual override. Alarms blared instantly. I didn't care. Fluid drained from the pod. George's body slumped forward. I broke the seal, ripped the cables from his arms, caught him before he fell. "Come on, soldier," I whispered. "Wake up." His eyes fluttered, faint, distant, but alive. He whispered something I barely caught. No, you're here." Then the door burst open. Hawthorne stood there with 2 armed men, fury masked behind false composure. "I warned you, Captain," he said. "He wasn't meant to be found. You turned soldiers into test subjects," I spat. "You murdered your own to protect your lies." He stepped closer. "We built the next generation of warfare. Soldiers without fear, without conscience. Your husband was the first to survive the process." I looked down at George, trembling, broken, but human. "No," I said quietly. "He survived you." I fired once, straight into the control panel behind Hawthorne. Sparks erupted, alarms screamed, the containment pods shattered one by one. The facility began to crumble under its own power surge. I dragged George toward the exit, the sound of collapsing steel behind us. Flames licked the corridor, smoke curling like ghosts around our escape. Outside, the night sky was red with fire. We collapsed behind a dune, both gasping. His pulse was faint but steady. He tried to speak again, voice weak. "You found the file?" I nodded, tears cutting through the dust on my face. "I did, and I'm burning it all down." He smiled, the smallest flicker of the man I knew. Then, it wasn't for nothing. When the explosions finally stopped, dawn had already begun to bleed across the horizon. The facility was gone, but the truth wasn't. I had it all. The drives, the footage, the names. George's mission hadn't ended in death. It ended in revelation. He had died to expose them. And I had lived to finish it. They say vengeance is a mission without a map. Maybe that's why I knew exactly how to follow it. When the desert finally stopped burning, I left Al-Nair behind like a grave with no name. George was alive, barely. And I had proof that could dismantle everything Colonel Hawthorne built. But survival wasn't victory. Not yet. We hid for 3 days in an abandoned outpost near the Syrian border. George's body was weak, his mind fractured by what they'd done to him. Some days he remembered my name. Others, he stared through me like a stranger. I wanted to hold him and scream at the same time. He had been rewritten, not completely, but enough to make me see how far men like Hawthorne would go to turn loyalty into obedience. I spent those nights decrypting the last sections of the file. Inside were full lists of personnel involved in Operation Sand Veil, scientists, officers, politicians. Men in suits who'd never set foot on a battlefield but had rewritten wars from conference rooms. Every name was a bullet waiting for justice. George's strength returned slowly. His hands shook when he tried to speak, his words broken, but the soldier in him was still there, buried beneath the programming. You have to finish it," he whispered one night. "Expose them, or they'll do it again." "I will," I promised. "I just need you to hold on." He nodded weakly, eyes dim. "I knew you'd come." It was the first time his voice carried certainty. The same tone he'd used when briefing his men, when the world around us still made sense. That tone lit something in me. It wasn't grief anymore. It was resolve. I sent the files to every contact I still trusted, old comrades, foreign journalists, underground networks that specialized in the truth governments feared. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. If I wanted to bring them down, I'd have to face them publicly. On record, no shadows this time, so I set the date. The Global Security Summit, Geneva. Every defense minister, contractor, and intelligence head in one room, the perfect stage for a reckoning. Getting there was the easy part. Getting in took every trick I'd ever learned, a forged ID, a hidden transmitter in my jacket lining, and the kind of cold confidence that comes from having nothing left to lose. I slipped through the glass doors under a new name, blending with the flow of officials. Cameras flashed, reporters buzzed, and somewhere near the front, I saw him, Colonel Charles Hawthorne, alive, promoted, standing at the podium as the keynote speaker. His voice rolled through the room, rehearsed and poisonous. The success of Sand Veil has set a precedent for future operations. I didn't let him finish. I walked down the center aisle, calm, measured. Security tensed, hands on earpieces, but I raised both palms, not in surrender, but in command. "Maybe tell them what Sand Veil really was, Colonel," I said, loud enough to cut through the room. Or shall I show them myself? He froze. The name he hadn't heard in years cracked through the air like a shot. Rose Puller, he muttered. You shouldn't be here. Oh, I should have been there all along, I said. While you were running experiments on your own men. While you were burying soldiers under false graves. While you were rewriting the meaning of service. I tapped my transmitter. The screens behind him flickered. One by one, the footage from the drives began to play. Helmet cams, data logs. His voice authorizing containment. The image of George in the pod. Gasps erupted across the hall. Cameras turned. The world watched. Hawthorne lunged toward the console, shouting for the feed to be cut, but I stepped forward, my voice steady. You taught us loyalty, sir. But loyalty without conscience is treason. Chaos ignited. Officials shouted, guards moved in. But the feed kept running. Every word, every scream, every face. The truth was out, too vast to erase. I turned toward Hawthorne as security swarmed him. His calm was gone. The arrogance had rotted into desperation. You destroyed everything, he hissed. No, I said quietly. You did. I just lit the match. And then I walked out. That night, the world changed in slow motion. By dawn, international agencies had launched full-scale investigations. Sand Vale was exposed. Every covert experiment, every death, every falsified report. Hawthorne was arrested, his name dragged through headlines across continents. The system that once protected him now ate him alive. But victory didn't feel like peace. Because peace, for soldiers, is always temporary. I found George weeks later in a recovery center run by independent medics. Safe, but still haunted. His memory was patchy, yet when I entered the room, he smiled. Mission complete? He asked softly. I nodded. Mission complete. He reached for my hand. Then we made it. I wanted to tell him the truth, that I didn't make it out whole, that I'd lost parts of myself along the way. But instead, I said what soldiers say when the war is finally over. We did our duty. The world would call me a whistleblower. Some would call me a traitor. But I was neither. I was a soldier, one who refused to let her uniform become an alibi. The cost had been everything. My career, my name, the version of George I once loved. But as I watched the sun rise through the hospital window, I knew one thing for certain. His death had not been for nothing. He had died for the truth. And the truth had finally learned to speak. There's a sound that only soldiers recognize, the quiet that comes after war. It isn't peace. It's the absence of orders. The moment when the world forgets your name, but your mind doesn't. That's where I found myself. 6 months after Geneva, I was living under a new identity in a small coastal town, the kind of place where the ocean looks like forgiveness, and every sunrise feels like a second chance. I had traded my sidearm for solitude, my uniform for anonymity. But ghosts don't retire. They wait. George's recovery was slow. The facility in Cyprus had specialists who worked with trauma victims, ex-soldiers, prisoners, the broken ones who saw too much. I visited once a week, always bringing him something from our past. A photo, an insignia, sometimes a single dog tag. Each time, his eyes would search mine as if flipping through memory like a file he couldn't decrypt. We were soldiers, weren't we? He'd ask. Yes, I'd say softly. And we were more than that. Some days he remembered my laugh. Other days he only remembered the mission. But I learned to accept both. Because love, I realized, isn't about recognition. It's about showing up even when they don't remember who you are. The world moved on. Operation Sand Vale became a scandal in the headlines, then a case study in ethics, then finally a documentary narrated by people who hadn't bled for it. Hawthorne was stripped of rank, tried behind closed doors, and sentenced to life in a facility so remote, even his name disappeared. Justice served. History cleansed. But for me, it was just another kind of silence, because no matter how many trials were held, none of them could resurrect the soldiers buried under false reports, or the parts of me that died alongside them. One evening, As I sat by the shore, a courier found me. A sealed envelope. Government issue. No return address. Inside, there was a single photo, the one taken the day George and I graduated from the academy. And behind it, a short handwritten note. For every lie you burned, you gave others the courage to speak. History remembers the noise, but I'll remember your silence. A friend. I didn't know who sent it. Maybe someone inside still believed in the same oath we once took. To defend, not destroy. Maybe it didn't matter. I folded the note back carefully and placed it beside my compass. The only thing that still pointed home. A few weeks later, the hospital called. George had relapsed. The trauma had triggered a neural collapse. He wasn't expected to recover this time. I flew that night. When I reached his bedside, the monitors hummed softly, steady but fragile. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow. I sat beside him, taking his hand. The same hand that once steadied a rifle, that once held mine beneath a desert sky. He opened his eyes, cloudy but aware. Rose. Just my name, clear, unbroken, alive. Tears came before I could stop them. I kept my promise, I whispered. I found the file. The truth's out. You didn't die for nothing, he smiled faintly. Good. Mission complete, then? His eyes lingered on me. Not the soldier version of me, not the widow, but the woman who had carried both. Don't stay in the war, he murmured. Come home. Then the line went flat. And for the first time, I didn't salute. I just held his hand until it went cold. I buried him in the old barrack cemetery overlooking the sea. No uniforms, no flags, just silence. I placed the final mission file beside him, the drive that started it all. Then I took out a letter I'd written months ago and read it aloud, my voice trembling in the wind. You once told me that honor isn't about dying for your country. It's about living with the truth. I understand that now. You were the truth, George, and I'll carry you, not as a ghost, but as a promise kept. I folded the letter, tucked it under the soil, and saluted one last time. Not as his wife, not as his comrade, but as the last witness of the war we both survived. When I left the cemetery, the sea was calm, the kind of calm that feels earned. I walked barefoot into the surf, letting the water wash over the scars that still mapped my skin. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of the mission on my back. I felt the wind, light, unburdened, whispering the same words I'd heard in that desert outpost. You made it. Sometimes, I still dream of him, standing at the edge of the horizon, smiling the way he used to before the world taught us to fight it. I wake up reaching for him, but there's only sunlight, and somehow that's enough, because I kept my promise. Because he's free now. Because honor, once lost, has been reclaimed, and maybe that's all any soldier ever hopes for, to come home, even if it's just in someone's memory.